Do you know, whenever anyone does any kind of transaction, and I think maybe it's more so because we do so many things on mobile devices, whenever you do it, I think somewhere in your head you're going, Is it for real? Am I sending it to the right place? Is someone ripping me off? It's added to the ideas about fraud, isn't it? About how often you could be ripped off.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just having a conversation this morning about someone who said they were buying something, they were emailed and said, can you email us your bank details? And they were like, am I sure? So we're getting to know more about it. But still, more than £1.2 billion was stolen by criminals through fraud that we know last year. And that's the equivalent. If you put this into context, £2,300 every minute that we know has been lost to fraud.
And so what about the people committing those crimes? The National Crime Agency now calling for longer sentences for those convicted. BBC Radio 4's Money Box reporter Dan Whitworth is with us now. It is front and centre of so many people's thought processes now, and yet, you know, not many people caught. And then we're talking about sentencing, aren't we?
Yeah, and it's good that it's front and centre. It should be. People need to be aware of this. And every time we talk about this, it's helping people, even if it just sparks a conversation about fraud. And so I've been speaking to Adrian Searle. So he's in charge of what's called the National Economic Crime Centre, and that's part of the National Crime Agency. So one of the UK's top law enforcement officials in the fight against fraud. And he basically told me the maximum sentence for people convicted of fraud at the moment is 10 years. But the average sentence is 2 years. Right. And even in the most serious cases, when the NCA is involved, and they are serious cases, the average sentence is 4 years. Now, Adrian Searle told me the reason for that is at the moment, sort of sentencing guidelines, they focus on the financial impact, so how much money was stolen. But you guys know, because you speak to victims, I certainly know, I speak to a lot of victims, the emotional impact, the psychological impact can be massive. And he told me he wants more of that taken into account.
Well, we support longer sentences for the frauds that are causing the highest harm. And in particular, we're keen that the emotional impact of fraud is taken into consideration. That's why we support the Sentencing Council review into sentences, which is looking at whether other harms beyond financial loss are appropriately reflected.
OK. So, fine, you can call for longer sentences, whether or not that makes a difference, but you've got to catch people in the first place and convict them.
Right, so I'm going to give you some numbers now for context on the scale of this problem. In the year to March, the Home Office recorded figures for England and Wales in fraud offences. So this isn't a survey, this is hard data. The recorded offences, there were 1.125 million recorded offences of fraud. Of those, 4,000 ended up in court. I'm going to give you that again. 1.125 million recorded offences of fraud, 4,000 ended up in court. Now, that means in those cases, 99.6% of the time, the fraudsters got away with it. Now, Adrian Searle says he accepts that the police response is not where it should be. And basically, he said that the issue is, obviously, with so many fraud cases being reported, it's obviously clearly a massive issue. And in fact, that we've been speaking to one particular case, or we've been finding out about one particular case, a gentleman called Steve Wright, and he works for Kent Brushes. It's a small business, it's got about 40 employees. And he told me how his financial controller was targeted by very sophisticated, ruthless scammers in July. They managed to persuade him they were calling from his bank, Barclays Bank. They convinced him to go to a website, look just like Barclays Bank website. They manipulated him, they psychologically tricked him, they got control of his accounts, and they managed to steal £1.6 million through 39 transactions in less than 20 minutes. He told me about it.
The response from the bank, they don't care. The response from Action Fraud, well, there hasn't been one. It's not been taken seriously. And if that's how we're treated, losing £1.6 million, you know, many other victims, many in vulnerable positions, who, I mean, I can't even imagine how they must feel as well.
Devastating. And what's Barclays said, Dan?
Well, I've got a statement from Barclays, and it's important to read this out, so I'm going to. So Barclays said it was evident their customer, obviously Steve at Kent Brushes, had been the victim of a sophisticated scam. This is all good advice for everyone, in fact. They said no bank will ever ask people to hand over sensitive data like one-time passcodes or PINs, adding it believes working with law enforcement is essential to stopping scams and catching fraudsters. Also, that a great deal of fraud awareness and education information was provided to Kent Brushes about scams in general, also about this scam in particular. It added, finally, the case has been thoroughly investigated at the highest levels, and its decision remains unchanged that the business customer will be held liable. Now, for its part, that means no refund. For its part, Action Fraud admitted recording the details of the crime incorrectly. It's apologised and put in place measures to ensure this doesn't happen again. And finally, the Ministry of Justice says that fraud sentences since 2010 have doubled to that 24 months, which Adrian Searle says is not enough, keeping offenders off the streets for longer.
Those are amazing figures, and it's a really interesting story. If you had one thing, I mean, literally one thing you'd say to someone who's doing a transaction today, and for a moment they go, what do you say?
Stop, pause, take a minute. If you're at all suspicious, just take a minute. No company will ever be offended if you hang up the call, look online, get a genuine number and call them back. Just pause, take a minute. Fraudsters will always try to rush you. Don't allow yourself to be rushed.
And also, if you can talk to someone, just mention it to someone.
That helps break the spell that fraudsters put over people.
Exactly.
Definitely.
Dan, thanks so much.